Where this race stands on this Labor Day, we want to bring in Nomiki Konst, a Democratic strategist and a former DNC platform committee member, also joined by Republican strategist Dave Wilson. Good morning to you both. Nomiki, let's start with you. Thanks for, on a holiday morning no less, getting up early. We do appreciate that. Yes. Thank you.
You too.
Yeah, they were paying me.
Yeah.
All right. A new ABC News Ipsos poll found that Harris maintains a slight lead among overall likely voters, of course, right? So while the vice president did not, though, get that balance that some were expecting after a strong, solid convention, a well-produced convention there in Chicago. So she's up by 4 points. And the poll found she's even widened the gap with women voters. Granted, there's 2 months to go. Polls can be wrong, but do you think there's anything in those numbers that are encouraging for the long haul here?
Well, I think that Harris-Walz campaign is taking this very seriously. They know that presidential elections are always very close in this modern era, and there's nothing to take for granted here right now. But one plus here is that women are more likely to vote. They're more consistent, more reliable voters, and sometimes there can be a higher number because throughout history we've seen that women sometimes aren't even reflected in the polls, especially those swing female voters, middle-aged, middle America moms, the hard-to-get voters. They're often not reflected in the votes. And I believe, as we're seeing in states like Florida, where there are women that are registered Republicans who are polling, in favor with abortion access, rights to abortion, you're going to see a lot more conservative voters that are female voting for Harris this cycle. That's just my prediction, based on just the all-out assault on women's rights by the Republican Party, by the Trump Vance ticket right now.
Well, speaking of that, Dave, former President Trump recently announced he would protect access to in vitro fertilization treatment, commonly known as IVF, and have either the government or insurance companies pay for it. It's gotten split reaction from Republicans so far, so let's take a listen to that.
It is expensive for many couples. I understand that. So it's something I'm open to, that most Republicans would be open to.
I would support a tax credit, means tested, kind of like we do with children. That makes sense to me to encourage people to have children.
But you wouldn't support this idea of mandating insurance companies to cover this, would you?
No.
I mean, you've already voted against it.
Because there's no end to that.
So how do you think the former president is navigating this issue on reproductive rights, and how should voters take kind of the flip-flopping stance that he has?
It's a very difficult thing to really look at and try to understand, because IVF isn't expensive. Every cycle that you go through is about $20,000, and that is a lot for families to have to deal with. Insurance companies, are, in some cases, pay for a portion of that. But I think the Trump administration, any administration, should start looking at other alternatives that we're seeing here, because you've got things like concepts like Make Birth Free are out there right now that really say, okay, what can we do to actually make it more affordable for a family to be able to have children? And in the case of IVF, one of the big issues that comes up with this right now, Alex, is the fact that the embryos that are created, those that are not implanted, what are you going to do with those? And that's the place where I think sometimes you have people who are coming in and saying, listen, they're wanting to take away these rights. It's not necessarily that they want to take away the rights, because that is a bit of a stretch, honestly, to be able to say that. But at the same time, you've got to start asking the ethical question as to what's going to happen with these children who are in an embryonic state waiting to be implanted.
But Dave, let's talk raw politics for a second. Conservatives in this country got for decades what they wanted when Roe fell. And it's been a political loser for Republicans ever since. Now Donald Trump's out there saying, oh, all of a sudden, I support IVF. And then he calls quite a stir saying, oh, I don't know how I feel about that Florida 6 week ban.
It's too quick.
Then the very next day, after the pro-life crowd got back in his ear, oh, no, I do support that. There's a lot of mixed messaging on this issue. There's never, and for all of the talk about Harris flip-flop on this, Trump's views on abortion have been all over the place for years, and they're realizing it could hurt them, particularly with women, of course, and they're trying to clean up on aisle 6, and it's a lot of mixed messaging. How are you really rectifying that Donald Trump's the party of IVF and no abortion limits? Come on.
That's That is a real quandary that they're in right now, Rob. Let's just be honest. Back to raw politics here. This is a place where, right, well, and very often you find Donald Trump will say things all the time, and the advisors come back and go, wait a minute, did you mean to say this? Did you mean to say that? And I think what you're actually looking at here is real discussions that are starting to come up that you can't just gloss over with a quick little, oh, well, we'll do this or we'll do that. It really boils down to how are we going to handle some very tough, difficult ethical issues. And what they're also trying to do is to figure out where's that little sweet spot that they're going to be able to start appealing to the female demographic, which they feel right now, honestly, that they could be losing with Kamala Harris at the top of the Democratic ticket.
Nomiki, there have been renewed calls for a ceasefire after the recovery of 6 hostages killed by Hamas in Gaza, and there's protests there in Israel. We talked about that at the top of the show today. How important is it for Harris's campaign to get a ceasefire deal done and done soon?
It's incredibly important. And, you know, I think the issue here is that we're dealing with Benjamin Netanyahu, whose own administration, whose own military leaders are in opposition to him right now. I mean, he is so reliant on an incredibly conservative base and staying in power out of fear of being put into prison, basically, that he is willing to compromise the values of his own country, his own cabinet, go up against the United States foreign policy, because the Biden-Harris administration, it's very clear they're losing their patience with Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is unwilling to negotiate with Hamas with the deal on the table right now. You're basically dealing with a bad actor who's representing one of our closest allies, if not our largest ally around the world. So, you know, this is a very difficult situation for Kamala Harris to navigate and the Biden administration to navigate prior to the election. But I think the burden is really on President Biden right now to make sure that this deal happens ASAP before the election, because if the ceasefire deal happens before the election, it will undeniably be an electoral boost. But that's also not why it should happen. Let's keep in mind 40,000 people have been killed in Gaza, and the hostage, these hostages that were just found killed and dead in Gaza does not help the other side either. Everybody wants a ceasefire. I mean, that is what is incredibly clear. The families of the hostages want a ceasefire. The families of the hostages showed up, especially the American ones, showed up at the convention, supportive of the Biden policy. But I think that Harris and Biden need to go out there and talk more about what they are doing, being a little bit more transparent about the process, and perhaps being a little bit more clear that they're dealing with a bad actor, with Netanyahu, who's not willing to get this deal done. Because there is a concern electorally, not that we should be looking at the ceasefire deal as just an electoral situation, but there is a concern in key states that there is going to be a group of voters who are unwilling to turn out, and the Trump administration is trying to play off of that. Trump campaign. There are conservative movements to keep the Arab community from showing up at the polls. That was reported yesterday that there are conservative activists who are going out there and posting signs and starting organizations to prevent Arabs from turning out and buying ads on social media. So it is a concern. I think the opposite side is playing off of this division in the Democratic Party. It could mean enough in a key state, just as these swing states come down to a few thousand votes. We really need to take every vote seriously and do everything we can and articulate that in the most clear way.
And listen, it's an untenable position. I don't care who is in power in the White House. Dave, last 20 seconds to you here. Remind me again how Trump White House approach to Israel would be different, because he's even more politically aligned with Netanyahu than Joe Biden or Kamala Harris have ever been.
It's a very difficult situation, Rob, because you can go back to the old West Wing episode of Isaac and Ishmael. This is not something that just started. This has been around for thousands of years, and this is yet again another place where it has risen to the top because of the issues that are going on. A ceasefire right now, everybody wants to see an end to the battles and the wars that are going on. What Trump will do in this particular case, he'll do everything he can to support Israel because it's a strong position for certain conservatives and Republicans. So we're going to have to see where he goes with that. It's a real question because, again, his alignment with our senator here in South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, is going to be a very important thing that he's going to be looking for as he looks for support in Congress if he does win in November.
All right, Nomiki Konst and Dave Wilson, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. We'll be back after this.